Hi everyone. I'm presenting on the book The Infinity of Lists, written by Umberto Eco. It's being presented by Ashley Soulier and myself, Haley Theoharides. Italian novelist and philosopher Umberto Eco, who was born in 1932 and who passed in 2016, wrote The Infinity of Lists in 2009. It is a hybrid text consisting of art, theory, and literature. It takes the form of an anthology of lists interspersed with Eco's own essays cataloging forms of lists, their contents, reasons, qualities, purposes, effects, and so on. Written while Eco was in residence at the Louvre and as an extension of his curated exhibitions and events, The Infinity of Lists gathers together exemplary artworks as well as selections from a vast range of literature and attempts to group them together thematically. Much of the beauty of this volume lies in its capacity to provide the reader with that overwhelming, Eco describes it as dizzying, experience of the infinitude of the world and its ability to contain so many objects, words, meanings, images, creatures, feelings, etc. His writing about the literary lists is expository, while his inclusion of artwork is primarily placed as visual accompaniment to theory, loosely illustrating the conceptual topics of each chapter. The table of contents is pictured in the next slide as its own kind of meta list. The names of the chapters give a sense of Eco's writing style, which is somewhat playful and tongue in cheek, and his multifaceted approach to the topic of listing. He admits he was forced to leave many examples out, hence his emphasis on infinity. In the introductory chapter, Eco explores the theory that some lists in ancient times were written and illustrated to emulate a sense of something that was so big it was hard to describe fully. For example, the armies of Alexander the Great, pictured above. This type of list expression raised the stakes of the narrative. The form of a list allowed the creator to indicate that the army was so vast and powerful it was nearly impossible to say how many warriors or ships there were, that the amount was approaching infinity, and naming as many as possible would provide the reader with a similar experience of the ineffable. Eco writes, faced with something that is immensely large or unknown, of which we still do not know enough, or of which we shall never know, the author proposes a list as a specimen, example, or indication, leaving the reader to imagine the rest. Throughout the book, Eco delights in describing nearly every possible nuance of the list as a form, sealed area, or container for information. He lists lists and describes what he loves about them, why they are interesting to him, how they attempt to create order and exert power, and so forth. Some chapters in particular are more pertinent than others, especially for our class's purpose and for the purpose of this presentation. We found Chapter 7, There Are Lists and Lists, to be the start of Eco's more salient discussion about different forms of lists and how we create, define, and understand them. In this chapter, Eco makes an important distinction between, quote, practical or pragmatic lists and poetic lists. He writes, the practical list can be exemplified by a shopping list, the list of guests invited to a party, by a library catalog, by the inventory of objects in any place, such as an office, an archive, or a museum, by a restaurant menu, by the list of sights to see in a tourist guide, and so on. The characteristics of these practical, pragmatic lists are threefold. He writes, they have a purely referential function and have the purely practical purpose of naming and listing. Second, he writes, they record things that are really existent and known, and are therefore finite. Third, they may not be altered in the sense that it would be unethical as well as pointless to include in a museum catalog a painting that is not kept there. Here, as an example, I have included an excerpt from the Codex Mendoza of the Imperial Tribute List, an illustrated catalog of annual tribute due from the subject towns of the Aztec Empire. As you may have guessed, practical lists can indeed be poetic and vice versa. According to Eco, a lot has to do with intention of both the creator and later the reader/viewer. Pictured on this slide is one of my favorite images that Eco selects. It's an example of a practical list. It's the funeral stela of an Egyptian princess, which illustrates the food placed in her tomb. Eco writes that a practical list is never incongruous, provided we can identify the criterion of assembly that governs it. An example is this painting by Peter Blake, Litter, in which disparate objects are identifiable within the collective theme of things discarded by others. Collections are an important form of lists, and most are practical in their origin or traditional sense. The artist Joseph Cornell elevated and miniaturized the practice of collection. One of his artworks is pictured here. Historically, common collections range from religious items to loot or spoils of war, to personal collections and curiosity cabinets, to the collections of institutions such as museums and libraries. Typically, institutional collections include a written guide in the form of a list, inventory, or catalog, often in response to the fact that value is attributed to the items. All collections are open, revisable. Items may be removed or added, making them one of the more fluid types of practical lists discussed by Eco. While historically, some collections were curated for religious or personal reasons, Eco presents the fact that many collections evolved as a result of the plundering and seizing of the possessions of others, and so are, by virtue, complicit in the injustice of warfare. Eco writes, "They spring from rapine, the spoils of war." Quoting Pliny, he states, "It was Pompey's victory that created the fashion for pearls and gems, as those of Scipio and Manlius created the fad for tooled silverware, Italic cloths, and Triclinia adorned with bronze, etc." Eco continues, "From this booty, or, if you prefer, the right of conquest, sprang the accumulation of important objects and a pride in increasing that accumulation." He continues, "Whereas initially first people collected religiously and in private places, grave goods, or gifts received from the temple, collection very soon turned to objects that were signs or witnesses to something else, to the past they come from, to an exotic world of which they are only documents, to the invisible world." Of course, there are many iterations of collections. Here is an example of a curiosity cabinet, or Wunderkammer, a widespread 16th and 17th century phenomenon in which some collectors tried to, quote, "systematically collect all the things that ought to be known, while others collected things that seemed extraordinary or unheard of, including bizarre objects or amazing items." They were sometimes, quote, "cupboards, like miniature museums, full of compartments containing items that, removed from their original context, seemed to tell senseless or incongruous stories." Eco suggests that poetic lists, on the other hand, are not restricted to being purely functional, but are instead created for a variety of reasons that provide the reader and/or viewer and/or creator with an additional dimension of representation outside of purely referential needs, sometimes just for the delight of it, or to play with the constructions of importance and order, other times to provide a sense of overwhelm or confusion, to, quote, "dizzy the reader or make an interesting juxtaposition of entities, or to create chaotic enumeration. Or sometimes these lists evolved as a result of following one's own stream of consciousness, as in the writing of Joyce or Borges. Sometimes so-called poetic lists can be as vernacular as the lists you or I might write to ourselves. Here is a to-do list written by American music legend Johnny Cash. It sold for nearly $7,000 at auction. In chapter 20, Eco writes, quote, "The voraciousness of the list often prompts us to interpret practical lists as if they were poetic lists. And in effect, what often distinguishes a poetic list from a practical one is only the intention with which we contemplate it. It's also not impossible to read a poetic list as if it were a practical one." Eco explores the concept of enumeration and accumulation as a form of a list which gathers energy as it accumulates. He writes, "Since antiquity, rhetoric has encompassed rhythmically enunciated and enunciable lists, in which it was less important to hint at inexhaustible quantities than to attribute properties to things in a redundant manner, often for pure love of iteration. In general, the various forms of lists would consist of accumulations, or, in other words, the sequence and juxtaposition of linguistic terms belonging to the same conceptual sphere." It's difficult to wrap up a presentation on a book with the word infinity in the title, and Eco makes that clear with an open-ended conclusion, as if he were left no other choice but to end with an unfinished list. Beyond all of its theory, most of all, Eco's text encourages a curiosity and a wonder of the concept of lists, and he catalogs many beautiful examples that are worth discovery. We reviewed a handful of articles that range from scholarly journals, book reviews, opinion pieces, and interviews. The overall consensus is that Eco tries to grasp the incomprehensible. Eco articulates lists as a means for cultural order and form in the attempt to convey what is otherwise beyond articulation. This book has not received as much acclaim as some of his other works, and was even considered to be a coffee table book. Eco's point is that lists do not always impose order on the world as we might think, but this insight is never properly developed, partly because, as Max Rushbrook writes, the infinity of lists is a more beautifully illustrated essay than a full-length book, and partly because Eco often revels in the richness of his lists rather than dig deeper into them.